You're listening to the Immersive Audio Album Podcast.
Please listen with headphones for the best spatial experience. Hi everyone, and welcome to the IAA podcast. My name is Jonathan, and for the past several years I've worked as head of music at Immersive Audio Album. I'm here with Cameron, our lead developer. So Cameron, even though we've been working together for some time now, you recently told me that you're still relatively new to the world of immersive music. It sounds like maybe you have a home theater and you've watched some movies with surround sound, but you're still somewhat unfamiliar with the technology. With that in mind, I thought it'd be interesting to record a series of discussions where we do a deep dive into all things relating to surround and immersive music. So, where do you want to begin?
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for having me on. Well, to start things off, can you explain to me what spatial audio actually is?
Okay. So when you see a song or album on Apple Music labeled as spatial audio, that means it's been remixed from the original multitrack elements, or stems, into an immersive format called Dolby Atmos. As you already heard in our intro sequence, this podcast is presented in spatial audio, so I can move my voice beside you, over your right shoulder, or even directly above your head. This technology allows artists, producers, and mixing engineers to place the listener inside the music. When done right, the experience is hard to top. Now, surround sound for music isn't a new concept. It's been tried before, with admittedly mixed success. But Dolby Atmos is easily accessible to listeners in a way these prior formats were not. So before we started working together, did you know that surround sound for music was even a thing?
Yeah, I remember looking for surround sound music and it just not being available in many places that I looked. I've only recently discovered how much surround sound music is actually available, and to add to that, I had no idea that the history goes back so far. So take me to the beginning. When and how did surround sound technology first get introduced to the public?
In the film world, I think the original surround system was Disney's Fantasound, developed for their animated film Fantasia in the year 1940. As I understand it, the engineers had the ability to pan 3 distinct sound sources across a larger array of anywhere from 5 to 8 speakers. The system was remarkably ahead of its time. In fact, it's eerily similar to how Dolby Atmos allows for audio objects to be moved seamlessly across a larger speaker array. Since we're in an immersive environment, I can give a simple demonstration of what this might have sounded like. Right now, there's just one active sound source, my voice, panned directly in front of you. But I'm going to add another sound, a car driving, which you should now hear slowly moving from left to right behind your head as I'm speaking. Finally, I'll add a third sound, a bell ringing, which should now be emanating directly above your head. Having just 3 mix elements might seem very simple by today's standards. After all, Dolby Atmos supports up to 128 object channels. But you have to remember that this was more than 80 years ago, so it's pretty remarkable. Now Cameron, what was the first film you experienced in surround sound?
I had a DVD of the first Star Wars movie, and I remember that being the thing that my dad used to test our family surround sound system. I remember later on reading that in 1977, Star Wars was like the first surround sound film. But it's actually fascinating to hear that surround sound audio was available to the public so early on. Did the Fantasound system become like a standard in movie theaters all the way back then?
Sadly, it didn't, because it was so expensive to outfit theaters with the equipment. Fantasia premiered in November 1940, just 13 months before the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the United States' entry into World War II. I think Disney was planning a series of road shows where they'd bring the Fantasound system to different cities all around the country, but the war put a stop to all of this. Apparently, all but one of the prototype systems ended up being dismantled, so the raw materials could be repurposed for the war effort. However, you could argue that it's actually because of events during World War II that the recording industry as we know it today came to be. For example, did you know that the earliest magnetic tape recorders were a result of technological advancements made during the war?
Oh, wow. So the World Wars didn't hamper developments in audio recording technology?
No, not at all. In 1944, Allied forces captured an Axis broadcast facility in Luxembourg. Inside, they discovered a mysterious German recording device called the magnetophone. It was far more advanced than the wire recorders the military was using at the time. The device was later brought back to the US for further study. One of the soldiers assigned to study the magnetophone, Major John Herbert Orr, happened to be an engineer by trade. After the war ended, he used what he learned to found his own tape company. The company, Orr Radio, was later purchased by the Ampex Corporation, who went on to become one of the biggest tape manufacturers in the country.
Have you ever stopped to think how magnetic recording affects your life every day? Probably not. The Mojo has. Magnetic recording has caused a musical revolution around the world. Dr. Donald Walter has. Magnetic recording is helping him discover the secrets of the brain. Entertainers have. Magnetic recording has constantly and dramatically improved the world of radio and television. Sports fans have. Magnetic recording has created a visual excitement for almost every major sport. Astronaut Michael Collins has. Magnetic recording helped make his moon flight possible. Throughout the world, in science, medicine, education, industry, and entertainment, magnetic recording is an increasingly important part of our lives. Here, for the first time, is this remarkable story.
Ampex was working closely with Bing Crosby, one of the biggest stars of the era and a key advocate for magnetic recording. Crosby later gifted an early Ampex studio recorder to his friend, the now legendary guitarist Les Paul. Paul modified the machine by adding a second playback head, allowing him to layer new sounds on top of those he'd already recorded. This practice later became known as multitrack recording. By the early 1950s, Ampex were producing quarter-inch machines that could record 2 to 3 tracks of audio at once. These later evolved into half-inch machines, which could record 3 or 4 tracks simultaneously. At the behest of Les Paul, Ampex produced their first 8-track machine in 1957. Now, this is an oversimplification of decades worth of history, but the crazy thing is, you can trace this sequence of events all the way back to Major John Herbert Orr discovering the magnetophone at that German base in Luxembourg, way back in 1944. It really was a case of the right person being in the right place at the right time. By the early 1970s, when most studios were using 8-track, and some had even transitioned into 16-track, the industry was finally ready to move beyond stereo. Hence the next step, quadraphonic sound. Are you familiar with the term quadraphonic?
I've heard the term before, but what exactly is quadraphonic sound?
Well, I'm glad you asked. Now, to answer your question more eloquently than I ever could, we have a special guest.
Quati is quadraphonic sound. Quadraphonic sound is the recreation of music as you hear it live. This new sound experience is created by playing simultaneously 4 separate sound tracks through 4 separate speakers strategically placed in a room or car. 2 in front of you and 2 behind you, giving the nearest sound approach to actuality yet achieved. So, sit back and enjoy the sound sensation of the 70s, quadraphonic sound.
Now, in all seriousness, quadraphonic sound was an early surround music format that used 4 speakers arranged in a square formation around the listener. The first 4-channel music mixes were done in the late 1960s, and by the mid-70s, all the major record labels, including CBS, Warner Brothers, and RCA, were releasing popular albums on quadraphonic vinyl and tape. In fact, that recording you just heard was from an EMI sampler cartridge released in the early 1970s. It might seem crazy today to suggest putting 4 giant speakers in your living room, but from what I've heard about the 70s, the culture was so different. People actually had home hi-fi systems in their living rooms. Did anyone in your family have a stereo system?
Yeah, my uncle had one. It makes me wonder if he were to have invested in a quadraphonic system, what would he have heard? Is quadraphonic sound like being at a live performance, like described in the commercial that you had just played? How did the artists and producers utilize this new format?
I suppose it could be like a live performance, but it depended on the mixer's preference. Some quad mixes present more of a live atmosphere, with the instrumentation up front and mostly ambience in the rear. Others instead offer a less realistic, immersive experience, with instruments panned entirely behind the listener. So if you wanted to, you can make it sound like you're standing on stage, surrounded by the band. Going with this scenario, if you were on stage facing the audience, then the drummer would be playing behind you. Then, if there's an acoustic guitar player, maybe he's standing on the right side of the stage. Finally, keyboards could balance things out over on the left side. Basically, you're limited only by your imagination. I think part of what I find most appealing about 70s quad mixes is that the 4 channels tend to be treated like equal partners. There's usually as much sound panned behind you as there is in front of you. But it could easily become gimmicky if you overdo it. For example, one of the very first popular albums to be released in quad was Santana's Abraxas. Listening to this album today, you could tell they tried to turn it into a tech demo rather than really serve the music. Carlos Santana's guitar is just constantly spinning around the room.
Okay, so you've told me about some bad or some experimental mixes, but is there one particular album in quadraphonic that really showed off the merits of using quadraphonic surround sound?
So I think the album considered synonymous with quadraphonic sound would have to be Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. Pink Floyd were actually one of the first bands to experiment with a quadraphonic PA in their live performances. In fact, on stage they had a custom-made joystick-like device called the Azimuth Coordinator, which they could use to fly instrument signals around the audience during the shows. It must have been an amazing experience. Dark Side of the Moon was their first studio album to be released in quadraphonic, mixed by Alan Parsons. Now, I've not found any evidence that the album was actually recorded with quadraphonic reproduction in mind, but some passages do really feel like they were made for it. For instance, in the song Tham, there are 4 alarm clocks that cascade off each other from the 4 corners. Or in the song Money, there's the cash register that bounces from speaker to speaker around the listener. For some fans, the quadraphonic mix of Dark Side of the Moon is the definitive version of this classic album. Sadly, because the format was so short-lived, probably not that many people got to hear it that way.
This podcast is sponsored by Immersive Audio Album, your #1 online hub for all things surround and immersive music. On our website, you'll find album and equipment reviews, interviews with industry professionals, and a whole lot more. In our online shop, you'll find a large catalog of high-res digital downloads in 5.1 surround sound, Dolby Atmos, and R3D. At IAA, we believe fans deserve to own their music in the highest quality possible.
So where we left off, you were talking about how the quad mix of Dark Side of the Moon is the definitive way of listening to that particular album. And it's a shame that so many fans didn't get to listen to this stellar version of this album because the format died off right around the time of its release. Do you think quadraphonic was an unsuccessful format?
Well, yeah, because it ended up not becoming the industry standard. Now, the reasons why it failed are something that fans have been debating for years. Some people say it's because of the cost of the extra equipment, or just because there weren't enough popular records available in the format. Though some of the biggest acts of the 70s did release albums in quad, examples include Billy Joel, Steely Dan, and the Eagles, there were some big omissions. For instance, Led Zeppelin and Elton John, two of the most popular artists of the decade, didn't have any quadraphonic releases. Now, I think there is some truth in both these arguments. But, as someone who's acquired all the vintage gear and explored all the various quadraphonic formats, I think a big factor was the difference in experience with vinyl versus tape. It took some creative thinking to figure out how to fit 4 channels of audio on an LP. They came up with a few different methods, but the most common one appeared to be what they call a matrix process. As I understand it, in the studio, the mixing engineer would create what they called a discrete 4-channel master, which would be printed to half-inch tape. At the very same time, the discrete 4-channel output of the mixing console would be processed through an outboard device that collapsed it down to stereo, while shifting the rear speaker information out of phase. This encoded stereo mix, as they called it, would then be pressed onto an LP, and the listener would have to decode it back to 4 channels using an external device that sat between their phono preamp and their amplifier. Now, I think this is pretty clever, because the supply chain for mass-producing vinyl LPs was essentially unchanged. They could use the same pressing plants, and on the user end, it didn't require like a different kind of cartridge or a different kind of turntable. You could use all the equipment you already had. In fact, even if you didn't have a quad system, the quad LPs would still play in standard stereo. Now, the problem with this process is that because the mix was being collapsed to 2 channels, then reconstructed back to 4 channels, you would start to lose separation between the speakers. So, for example, if there was a guitar mixed entirely to the left back corner, after going through this process, you might hear it loudest in that location, but you'll also hear it at a reduced level in the other 3 speakers. It's really a shame because the quad experience on tape, especially the open reel format, really was amazing. Support for quad began to wane in the mid-70s, and the format was completely gone in the United States by the end of the decade. So at this point, a new company began to lead the charge in terms of surround sound innovation. Have you ever heard of Dolby?
Yeah, of course I've heard of Dolby. Everyone's heard of Dolby. I know the original Star Wars was mixed in Dolby Surround. But how did Dolby get their start in surround sound?
It's an interesting story. As many listeners already know, Dolby's original product was actually a noise reduction process for tape. They figured out how to reduce the background hiss without negatively affecting the overall fidelity of the recording. There were several different Dolby noise reduction systems, including the A format for professional grade masters and the B format for consumer tape. Their first surround system, ironically called Dolby Stereo, utilized a matrix process, just like quadraphonic vinyl. But the speaker configuration had changed. Instead of a square formation, this would be front left, front right, rear left, and rear right, it was instead a diamond shape. Left, center, right, and a single surround channel. The idea was for the center speaker to anchor the film dialogue. By the early 1980s, Dolby had reworked the system for home use. So if you bought a pre-recorded VHS or Betamax movie, it most likely had a Dolby encoded soundtrack. Just like with quad LPs, you needed an outboard decoder to recover the additional channels. Eventually, the left, center, right surround format was reconfigured into modern-day 5.1 surround sound. Do you have a 5.1 system?
Yeah, I've had a 5.1 system growing up. I've had it for a long time. I remember helping my dad wire a bunch of speakers under all the couches. The movies we bought were on DVD, and those had surround effects, but I couldn't remember if he had any 5.1 music. I didn't even know at the time that 5.1 music existed. When did 5.1 surround sound music start?
So the first dedicated 5.1 music format was called the DTS-CD. These were released in the 1990s. DTS, if you don't know, is Dolby's main competitor in the surround sound arena. Their initial claim to fame was incorporating DTS technology into the film Jurassic Park, which was a huge success. Steven Spielberg, who obviously directed that film, was an early investor in DTS. Though the CD format doesn't natively support surround sound, DTS figured out how to hide their digital bit stream onto the disc. So you could get discrete 6-channel surround sound from a standard Redbook CD. It was pretty revolutionary at the time. Now, this was the first discrete surround music format to become available to consumers since the quadraphonic tapes of the 70s. But ironically enough, many of the earliest DTS music releases, including Paul McCartney's Band on the Run, the Steve Miller Band's Fly Like an Eagle, and the Moody Blues' Days of Future Past, actually used digital transfers of 70s quad mixes. The producers would derive fake center and subchannels from the original 4-track master, and then pass off the result as a modern 5.1 remix. So have you ever heard of DTS?
Yeah, I think I remember seeing the DTS logo on some DVD movies, but the Dolby logo seemed much more common than that.
So for DVD, the standard audio track was what they called Dolby AC3, or more commonly known as Dolby Digital. This format also supports discrete 5.1 surround sound, but with lossy data compression. Now, DTS is also a lossy process, but it offers higher quality audio than Dolby Digital. With the growing popularity of DVDs in home theaters in the late 90s and early 2000s, it seemed like the perfect time for the music industry to reintroduce surround sound music. Around the year 2000, 2 new audiophile music formats were introduced: Super Audio CD, or SACD, and DVD audio. Both of these formats supported lossless 5.1 surround sound and stereo.
In the beginning, there was silence. Early man, Homo silencio, as yet didn't need ears. With the arrival of more and more sounds, Mono sapiens walked onto the stage of life.
Imagine the primitive ear as being something like the horn of a gramophone here on the forehead.
Hearing was born. But really, the arrival of stereo technology several thousand years later should have encouraged evolution to come up with something new.
2 ears.
Man's perception of sound improved dramatically. Let's call it one of nature's strokes of genius.
Now our ears can pick up the most complex of sounds, But only the Super Audio CD has created a new era of surround acoustic. And as far as we know, this is the future of sound.
Now, these formats have none of the issues that quad vinyl and tape had. The listener was getting a perfect reproduction of what the mixer heard in the studio. There was no loss of separation between channels, and no loss in sound quality. But however, let me ask you this. In the early 2000s, how were you listening to music?
Oh, let me think about that. 2000s. I think the thing I used the most was an iPod, but iPods didn't support surround audio. I guess, do you think the popularity of the iPod, because I know me and all of my friends, that's what we were using, affected the popularity of surround sound music? Do you think the iPod actually held the industry back?
It's funny, people seem to have gotten nostalgic about physical media today, but back then I have to think that any kind of disc-based media would seem instantly antiquated when you could now put 1,000 songs in your pocket. The interesting thing about 5.1, though, is that, unlike quad in the 70s, where people just stopped mixing in the format altogether, surround music never really went away. The major labels had mostly abandoned SACD and DVD-A by maybe 2010 or so, but there was still a small yet avid fan base that persisted over the years. Between 2015 and 2019, which was when I got into surround sound, I bought just about every new 5.1 disc that became available. And a lot of these were from artists I'd never heard of, like Steven Wilson or Bruce Sword, who are now two of my favorite musicians. It was also during this period that popular albums started to be reissued in super deluxe box sets. Now, these box sets would often include a DVD or Blu-ray with a 5.1 mix. So I thought it would kind of stay this way. 5.1 would be like a boutique product for a small but dedicated community. But right now, we're in the midst of a third industry-wide launch of surround or immersive music, as it's called today, and it's by far the biggest one to date. So what do you know about Atmos?
I remember my first Atmos movie being Brave, but aside from that, I don't know how it compares to the previous formats. How much better is Atmos for music? Do you think that Atmos music will finally succeed where 5.1 and quadraphonic music didn't really go mainstream?
I think an important thing to consider with this is that if you want to listen to a 5.1 mix or a quad mix, you really do have to have 4 or 5 loudspeakers arranged in the proper locations around your listening space. If you don't match the system that it was mixed on, you're not hearing the mixer's intentions. But with Atmos, this isn't a consideration anymore. You could use anything from a soundbar to a full-blown 7.1.4 or larger speaker array. It can even be converted into a binaural audio stream for playback on headphones. That being said, I think Atmos' greatest strength, its ability to adapt to all these different playback scenarios, is also in some ways a weakness. The problem is that what sounds good in a speaker environment doesn't always translate well to headphones. So have you listened to any songs in spatial audio? If so, how do you think they sounded?
Yeah, I've listened to a lot of music on Apple Music using my AirPods Pro and the spatial audio feature, but I was only impressed with some of the albums that I've listened to. It sounds like, from what you're saying, that the most accessible version of surround, specifically spatial, and binaural have some limitations because we're using headphones instead of large speakers.
Certainly. Over the past few years, I've interviewed lots of artists and engineers that are working with Atmos, and many of them have expressed how difficult it is to create a single mix that satisfies both speaker listeners and headphone listeners. Now, for example, it might sound really good on headphones to completely hard pan a sound. Like you could have a guitar coming completely from the side right speaker and nowhere else. However, when you listen on a speaker system, that guitar might sound too isolated and just kind of detached from the rest of the instruments. The other big issue with Atmos is that albums are being released primarily via streaming, so listeners can no longer permanently own their music.
Yeah, that's a good point. With the advent of new technology and the internet, and a lot of people are using streaming services, but back in the day, you would be buying 5.1 physical media in quadraphonic tapes. You were more likely to buy albums on a physical format. But with Atmos being such a modern technology, the focus of distribution seems to be primarily on streaming.
That's partially true. Some Atmos mixes do get released on Blu-ray disc, but it's just a fraction compared to the amount of content that's up on the streaming services. I mean, I myself don't even know the extent of how many albums have been mixed in Atmos. It's a huge catalog. Now, as you know, at Immersive Audio Album, we offer high-resolution Atmos downloads, which use the same lossless codec as Blu-ray discs. I think this is the perfect compromise between streaming and discs. Listeners get to own a high-quality copy of the immersive mix, while the artists will save on all the authoring and manufacturing costs that are associated with physical media. It gives me great pride to say we built up a large catalog of several hundred Atmos mixed albums, including recent releases from Ray Charles, Mark Knopfler, The Church, Madeleine Peyroux, Queens of the Stone Age, and other big artists. So, having gone through all this history, are you surprised by what you've learned?
Yeah, I'm surprised. I had no idea that the history of surround went back so far. It sounds like there was such a complex road to get to where we are with Atmos. They have to take all of the lessons that they learned from quadraphonic and from 5.1 and finally use all of these learnings to create something that hopefully can continue to go mainstream. I hope Atmos is the one that we get to listen to for a long time.
You're so right. You know, I often think about the real hardcore fans who started out with quad in the 70s and have seen all these successive iterations of surround sound come and go. It must have been so disappointing to see the format dropped at a moment's notice, only to be reintroduced years later. To kind of close on that note, I remember my dad telling me that one of the last popular albums he bought in quad was the Eagles' One of These Nights, which came out in 1975. When their next album, Hotel California, came out about 18 months later, he kept waiting for a quad version to show up in the store. But of course, it never did. He ended up having to wait 25 years to hear that album in surround sound, when it was remixed to 5.1 and released on DVD audio in 2001. So, fingers crossed, things are looking pretty good for Dolby Atmos, at least for the foreseeable future. However, if history has taught us anything, it's that only time will tell. Thanks for listening to the first entry in IAA's podcast series. Stay tuned for the next installment, where we discuss the ins and outs of Dolby Atmos music mixing. What makes for a quote-unquote good immersive music experience? Why do some songs sound great in this format while others fall completely flat? We'll be sharing our thoughts next month. See you then!